Hello, I'm Ed Haig, and I wanted to share with you some of the findings from our new report into thought leadership impact. Now, many of you will know we spend a lot of time talking about the quality of thought leadership that's produced by consulting firms, and indeed we rate the quality of material produced by about 25 of the world's largest consulting firms. And for some time we've felt that it would be useful to discuss both the process by which that thought leadership gets created and also the impact that it has once it has been created. And indeed many of our conversations with consulting firms have led us down that road recently, so it's been an area we've wanted to investigate for some time. We've produced a short report recently on the process part, the kind of bit that happens up front, and that's available now. In fact, it's a small report and free of charge, so feel free to contact us and find out more about that. The next report will focus on this question of impact, and it's due out shortly, but I just wanted to take a few minutes to sort of share some of what we're finding with you. We started off speaking to about 400 people actually when we did this research, but we quickly discounted about 200 of them who either weren't reading thought leadership frequently enough or didn't seem to be able to indicate that there was a piece of thought leadership that they could remember. Just suggested to us that they weren't what we ended up calling our active audience. They weren't the people we really wanted to know about, although of course they in themselves are interesting to some degree. So we really focus on about 200 people, but these are very senior executives across a wide range of functions and sectors. So exactly the sort of people that most firms are targeting most thought leadership at. We wanted to know what's getting read, what's the thought leadership that's getting read and what isn't getting read, which firms are getting read, that's where it gets particularly interesting, and what does reading thought leadership lead to, what action do people take as a result of reading thought leadership. Now at the heart of that report is a comparison of the impact that 10 leading consulting firms are having with their thought leadership. When I say leading, I mean largest, some of the most familiar names in global consulting. What impact are they having with their thought leadership? We compare them, and I'll come on to that in a minute. We started though focusing on what makes for memorable thought leadership. What is it that makes people remember thought leadership? And perhaps the first thing that we were interested in there was how it gets to people in the first place. That was interesting in itself. Perhaps not entirely surprisingly, the vast majority of thought leadership seems to get, not actually the vast majority, but the biggest proportion of thought leadership gets sent to people by email from a consulting firm. So about 40% of people received the memorable thought leadership that they wanted to talk about as an email from the consulting firm. We analyse all the different mechanisms for getting thought leadership to people, but I want to just draw on one particular thing here which was of real interest to me, which is that when it comes to, if you like, pull mechanisms, so not mechanisms by which a consulting firm pushes its material to the reader, but mechanisms by which they pull it to themselves. It was very interesting to me to see that people were much more likely to visit the website of a consulting firm to browse for thought leadership than they were to search for it via a search engine. And I think that runs counter to the instinct of many consulting firms now, who are inclined, if you like, to treat Google as their homepage, to say that, do you know what, people will find our thought leadership via a search engine and they'll just come to the piece of thought leadership they want, they'll read it and they'll go away again. And this sort of somehow counters that. It actually suggests that when people are thinking about a particular issue, they don't think, I'm interested in finding out about mobile payments in India, I'll see if anyone's written a report about that. They think, I'm interested in finding out about mobile payments in India, I'll see if firm X has written anything about that. So they're thinking about a firm at the same time as they're thinking about an issue. And I think that's quite telling, suggesting to us that they have this firm in mind. And it suggests that firms have a bit more power, I think, to influence here than perhaps they thought they did. Of course, it also suggests that if you're not one of the firms that they inclined to go to, it's a bit more of an uphill struggle. We asked, you won't be surprised to hear about social media, and I know that's a subject of great interest to everyone involved with thought leadership at the moment. It sort of depends where you stand on the social media thing as to whether you find this good news or bad news, but about 9% of people who were talking about a memorable piece of thought leadership said that it came to their attention via social media. Now, going back to that idea of push or pull, I can't quite decide which way that is. Again, it's a slightly difficult thing to gauge within the social media environment. But 9%, I think to some people will probably be a bit disappointing, an expectation amongst many, I think, now that social media is really beginning to dominate the way thought leadership is promoted and distributed to people. On the other hand, this is now a mechanism that accounts for more thought leadership getting to people than those web searches I mentioned earlier on, which are about 8%, or indeed searching directly on a search engine. So clearly having quite an important role to play. We asked as well about what makes material stick in people's minds, and I won't mention that talk too much about the findings of that, but they're obviously in the report. What I thought it might be worth mentioning a little bit more about here is what readers do next, because I guess this is really right at the heart of the matter. So what action do people take? We found that it broke down into 6 areas. They tend to either discuss the piece of material with colleagues, with peers, with bosses, with subordinates. They do some further reading, so they look up other material that the firm's produced. They share it, again, with bosses, subordinates, peers, people outside work. They start to implement some of the recommendations of the report or the material. They buy, either from a professional services firm generally, or from the firm that sent them the thought leadership specifically. And I guess this is where one of the really interesting and most exciting bits of data in the whole report lies, because what it tells us is that 18% of people who could remember a specific piece of thought leadership said that they went on to buy professional services from that consulting firm. And I think that's really encouraging. They are, unsurprisingly, far more likely to share, to discuss, to do further reading, even to implement some of the findings. But the idea that 18% of people actually translate reading into buying activity, I think, is a pretty enticing one. And lastly, they're also quite likely to make contact either with the firm or with the author. And we've kind of broken those down to show who's most likely to do what, and which of those activities are most likely to be done by the reader. As I say, we then go on to the section about which firms are having what level of impact. Now, impact is quite a difficult thing to measure. In its simplest form, we think of impact as being about quality, which we know a lot about, multiplied by distribution, which, although we do a lot of research into on individual pieces, we know much less about at a kind of firm level. And those two multiplied tends to give us the impact of a piece of thought leadership. But as I say, with the distribution piece missing at a firm level at least, we have to find new mechanisms for assessing the impact that people are having with their thought leadership, that firms are having. And we find 4 ways to do that. There is first what we're calling for the moment consumption. It's about the amount that people are consuming. How much is the average person consuming of any particular firm's material? The next is about choice. If you put a question to someone which says, presented with material on the same topic from a range of consulting firms, which firm's thought leadership would you choose? The answer to that tell us a lot about, if you like, the brand of thought leadership, or the power that a firm has to influence people's choice of thought leadership. I think then the next part is recall. How likely are people, when we ask them to tell us about a particular piece of thought leadership that they remember, to mention an individual consulting firm? And lastly, this question of action, but very specifically around the buying piece. How likely are people to actually buy from the consulting firm as a result of reading the piece of thought leadership? Now, clearly there's not time here to go into all the detail of how one firm matches up against another, but there are 10 major consulting firms compared there. And I think one of the big messages that comes from it is that despite quality, which has been on the slide a little bit, I think, over the last few years from McKinsey does incredibly well when it comes to impact. They score very well in terms of how likely people are to have read their material, how likely they are to name McKinsey in answer to that question about which firm would you choose if you could choose material from anyone. They score pretty well as well in terms of how likely people are to have remembered McKinsey's thought leadership. So they're doing very well by all of those measures, and I think that speaks a lot to the quality of the distribution of McKinsey's material. So although there may be some stuff that isn't of such good quality, as indeed there is for every firm, it's quite likely that McKinsey are finding a way to focus in on the really good stuff to make sure that's what gets to readers. And I think it's quite plausible, the idea that the discipline taught to them by publishing McKinsey Quarterly has kind of given them that capability, that they're used to picking pieces and being quite deliberate in distributing them, communicating about them. McKinsey does a little less well in terms of the number of people it actually converts into buyers from its thought leadership, and I think that's interesting. And I think there's a lot that runs through this analysis of firms that points to the idea, because McKinsey looms large over so much in terms of impact, that its brand is very much a thought leadership brand. But it does have this shadow effect, and it makes it very difficult for other firms, many of whose quality, by our measure, is considerably better at the moment. So that dynamic, that interplay between consulting firms, I think ends up being very important. As I say, we've compared all of the firms. We've given quite a bit of detailed commentary on each firm in terms of each of those measures of impact, and in terms of the interplay between them in the report. We've also put into the report some case studies. So some of the material that people mentioned, we've kind of looked into that and found the story behind it. How did they get it? What did they do with it? What sort of material do they like? To really kind of unpick the story behind a piece of thought leadership, and also given our analysis of what we think was good about that particular piece of thought leadership. So that's out very soon. Should be out in the next week or two, and we have really high hopes for it. I think it's going to be a really exciting report. I think it's a great addition to the work we already do around quality, and I genuinely recommend it to anyone who has an interest in making sure that thought leadership isn't just good, but is actually impactful. If you want any more information, please get in touch with us. You'll find all our details on our website, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. Thanks very much.